Welcome to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with embodiment specialists from around the world. I'm your host, Mark Walsh. So on the show today, Irene Lyons. So Irene is joining us from Canada. She's a specialist in trauma, particular kind of neurobiology of trauma, the nervous system. She has a background in Feldenkrais, somatic experiencing, interesting stuff. I heard several very good podcasts that she's been on. So we've got her on the show. Irene, welcome.
Hello, thank you.
It's nice to have you here. How did you get interested in the body? What was your route into this?
Yeah, it wasn't planned. I was in high school, actually, living here in British Columbia. I was a girl that did a lot of skiing, downhill skiing, and had my first real injury in grade 12 racing, and I tore a main ligament in my knee. It's called the ACL. Maybe you know of that one.
Yeah, that's
yeah, and so that tore and went into the rehab process that you do after surgery. And I got really fascinated with the human body. I actually was brought up in a veterinary environment. Both my parents are veterinarians, so they looked after dogs and cats. And so I was always kind of in a medical field, but more animals. And so when I started figuring out my own body, it just kind of sparked. And at that time, I was about to try to figure out if I wanted to go to university. And so I decided to go into exercise science, rehab. Here in Canada, we call it kinesiology, but it's more of exercise physiology, rehab, that kind of thing, and absolutely loved it. And then fast forward, maybe 5 years in, I re-injured myself a few more times, skiing again, playing soccer. I was quite active, and the big injury was a complication actually from another surgery of my knees, another ACL rupture, and I broke my patella in half. So I was walking down some stairs, not doing anything crazy, and my kneecap just spontaneously broke in half for no real reason. We don't know why. I have my suspicions, but that happened, and then I had to get that fixed. I had to rehab. And that it literally marked through my entire body off. I was in a lot of pain. I was very kind of disjointed, lots of compensation because I was on crutches for so long. And what got me really interested in the body, so I was interested in it before, it was that all that I had learned in my degree and in learning how to be a fitness trainer and a rehab specialist, because that's what I was doing, nothing worked for me. So everything I had learned, much to my parents' chagrin and all their money towards my education, didn't work. And I was lucky enough, this is where the Feldenkrais work came in. I was still going to school, doing my master's, and was in a lot of pain. I was strong. So this is the interesting thing. I was really strong and fit, and I looked fine, symmetrically. You wouldn't think it, but there was just this internal tension that wouldn't go away. Stretching, nothing made a difference. And my physical therapist said, you should go check out this guy. He's a colleague, but he also is trained in this stuff called Feldenkrais. And that was really kind of an eye-opener to something that completely changed my life. It might sound miraculous, but within 4 weeks of just doing that, I didn't have any more muscle tightness. I wasn't in any more pain. It just completely restructured my body function. And I was still really young too at the time. I was in my mid-20s. So my system just kind of drinked up this new way of feeling and sensing and repiecing my movement patterns. And so that was in 2001. And got totally sucked in, decided to train to become a Feldenkrais practitioner. I trained with a wonderful guy by the name of Jeff Haller, who's an American. He studied with Moshe Feldenkrais, and really just went full bore with it. But then an interesting thing happened where I started practicing, and about, I'd say, I'm guessing here, but maybe about 50% of the people I worked with got better with various ailments like I had. And then there was this other subset of people that, even though we were doing really good Feldenkrais work, they were still stuck. They were still in pain. I'm like, what the heck have I, like, what am I missing? And then that's where I started to dig a little deeper. And all these people had very similar, not similar histories, but they all had some kind of big trauma in their life. Some of them were very, very, they came from abusive families, chronic stress, very disconnected from their systems. And so even in that case, the Feldenkrais wasn't working. And so I'm like, what am I missing now? So I came to that turning point. And somehow, I don't, to be honest, know how I ended up finding the work of Peter Levine, who's the founder of Somatic Experiencing. And that was in 2008. So gosh, 10 years now. And I've never really looked back since then. I've completely studied his body of work, some bodies of work from people who would be his sort of higher level colleagues. The work of Kathy Kane has really influenced my practice and what I do. So that's kind of the very quick version, quick and dirty version of how I got to here.
Let me summarize. So you're kind of active, sporty person, then you kneecapped yourself, essentially.
Yeah.
Have some Irish family who'd be proud. And
my dad's Irish, so there you go.
Well, there you go. There's an old tradition of that, especially in the north.
Yeah.
And a bit of a dark joke. And then you realized the kind of body approach to healing wasn't enough. So you went for the embodied approach. And for those listeners who are interested in the Feldenkrais method, we have episodes from Russell Delman and Jay on running. So I want to bookmark Feldenkrais on the other episodes where people explain it in much more detail. And then you went, okay, this embodied approach is better, but it's not really enough because there's a whole load of people that aren't getting better. And it looks like trauma is a part of that.
Yeah.
Is that a kind of fair summary?
That's a fair, beautiful summary. Yes.
All right. So trauma is your topic and you speak beautifully about this. So I want to get you going on this. So let's start at the beginning, because I know listeners have very wide degrees of experience. They may have not heard other podcasts. We've done a couple of podcasts on trauma. I've had various people on. But if they haven't, let's start just very simply. What is trauma? Yeah.
So there's, in our language, Mark, and we call Peter's work and the work that say, are you familiar with Bessel van der Kolk, Gabor Maté, Bob Scare? So we call it the new traumatology, which is a term that's been coined. It isn't well known, but in our line of work, we see trauma as not in the event. So a lot of people think trauma, they think car accident, they think war, abuse, that kind of thing. And while that can be traumatic, in our lingo, trauma is actually in the nervous system. So if I do a real quick, I like analogies. So if you take someone who is in a car accident, let's say, and it doesn't have to be big, like a minor fender bender, you have person A in this car accident and they walk away completely fine. They might have a little crick in their neck. Maybe they need to do a little stretching or something, but they walk away. The next day, they have no trouble getting into their car driving. No big deal. Person A is fine, even though they've had a bit of a traumatic event. Person B, same accident, same speed, same car, we'll just carbon copy it. They get into this little minor fender bender. Again, no broken bones, no jaws of life, any of that. And they walk away, but they walk away ending up completely undone. Over the months after that, they start getting pain, chronic pain. The whiplash doesn't heal. They become afraid to even drive. There's like a high level of anxiety, let's say. Over time, we might see that person starting to get more kind of classic fibromyalgia, chronic pain syndrome. And it makes no sense because they had this tiny little accident and it doesn't match up. And so in working with folks in my private practice, I don't work in private practice anymore, but when I did, I saw this exact representation in so many people. And what we find is when we look to their history, Mark, is that their system was literally filled to the brim with so much traumatic stress adversity, not able to self-regulate their system. And then that little traumatic, kind of do that with air quotes, that event, I should say, was enough to literally crack the system open. And so one person you might say, oh, well, that person had a great, they were fine, they were productive. But what we didn't know was what was underneath, kind of living in the basement, if you will, of their stress chemistry, what was living in their autonomic nervous system, basically stored up, and this is important, the fight, flight, and freeze responses. So they kind of had this, it's like they were carrying this extra luggage of stress, traumatic stress, and then this event occurs, and then this just unravels them. So that's one very specific example. But in our Western culture, it's more common than, say, the person going off to war and, seeing their entire brigade blown up kind of thing. That also will cause traumatic stress, PTSD, but not every single person that goes to war and sees that kind of thing ends up with post-traumatic stress. And so we look at, well, what's happening in their underlying physiology. So to kind of sum that all up, in our lingo, trauma is not in the event, it's in the nervous system. And a trauma basically would cause a dysregulated nervous system. And then from there, we can unpack what that actually means, which is a little more technical. But that's sort of the main difference in our world with trauma versus it being in the event. If that makes sense.
So trauma, used to be defined and still is, I think, in the DSM as, something involving threat to life or limb. Yeah. That was the sort of old school definition. We had a Israeli commando who's a trauma therapist now, called my friend Adi. And, he was telling us stories about being in the West Bank and being blown up and dropped out of helicopters and all the rest of it. And that's much more what people might think of as the kind of thing. Events. But what I'm hearing from you is there can be a kind of cumulative, the straw that broke the camel's back. There might be one little thing that sets it off, but there's a kind of cumulative impact of unaddressed or caught fight or flight, the freeze in the nervous system, which is kind of building up. But at some point that may get to a level which is clearly pathological and they need help, or it might express as some kind of chronic pain or something like fibromyalgia. And at other times it's just a sort of low-level shitty way of living that never gets looked at. They just go, well, I'm just kind of a jerk, or I just don't sleep very well, or my relationships are just bad, and they haven't necessarily even made that link to trauma. You got it. It's sort of, we say that these symptoms that we call the disease, like I'm really trying to change the language. We'll talk about an anxiety disorder or depression or fibromyalgia as a disease or an illness. And while we might call it that, it's actually the symptomology of a dysregulated nervous system. And the one piece of research that's so telling that really paints this picture, have you heard of the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experience Study? No, you haven't. Yeah. Average childhood experiences about of. Yeah. So that, that's a really, it doesn't show all of the kinds of traumatic stress that a child would experience growing up. But what it's shown completely with significance is that when there was adversity, chronic stress, the real key word actually is unsafety. When things were not safe. And it doesn't have to be abuse. It could be mom and dad hate each other and they don't know how to express it. And they're always kind of, pent up with their aggression, but they're not expressing it. The little person, the child, will feel that energetic tension, that fight flight that's not being expressed. And so even that, while we wouldn't think that's an abusive, adverse environment, it actually is. And so what we're seeing is that kind of toxic environment, when we're brought into it later in life, it pretty much sets up the person for these symptoms, this symptomology, these chronic illnesses. And it ranges from the pain, the anxiety, the depression, all the way to cancers and heart disease and autoimmune disease has been linked pretty much conclusively to these early traumatic, stressful experiences.
and not just one, like kind of living in this toxic soup for an entire childhood. And so that is a really, I think, interesting piece of research that shows that it doesn't have to be these big, war scenes. And from what I've experienced, Mark, it's in some ways, and this isn't to scare anyone, but it's the truth, it can be trickier to work with general civilians in the Western world who have what they consider to be a pretty good life. And, I don't have any trauma. I wasn't beaten. I wasn't sexually abused. We had plenty of food on the table. We had lots of money. How could that wasn't adverse? And so our system and our society almost creates these conditions of living that we think are normal, but actually they're not, if that makes sense.
Is there a risk here? Because I'm imagining my friend Addie in the background going, what the fuck do these middle-class Americans know about trauma, huh? Is there a risk that everything becomes trauma-related?
Mm-hmm.
Pretty much every illness, physical and mental under the sun, which I actually believe can have trauma connections. I think that's one risk. And isn't there another risk of should we be using that same word for someone that's been subjected to a gang rape as someone who has some slightly unpleasant experiences because their parents didn't feed them straight away? And then developed a bit of nervous system dysregulation. I mean, should we be using the same word? To me, it seems almost disrespectful for people that have really survived a lot of bad shit that we're using this word trauma so readily around everything.
Yeah.
It's deeply significant. I'm not disagreeing with you on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's. I think the language we have isn't perfect, and I think your point is very valid about the person who had horrific abuse. And, I've worked with folks who have been in very, very abusive situations, and not just family systems, cult-like situations that are very horrible, all the way to the person who has been a returning veteran from the Korean War, all the way to, I'm free to talk about my husband because he grew up in that perfect household in Palo Alto in Silicon Valley, all the money in the world, and yet he ended up with complex PTSD as a 20-year-old, and it was because of, there's this thing that we say, it isn't always what happened to you, it's what didn't happen to you. And so there's a very different subset of traumatic, if we want to call it, experience in, say, a Western setting, where it's that perfect white picket fence living where everyone's proper and no one's allowed to burp or fart, or be angry. And while it's so tough to say, well, how can that be worse than someone who's on the war field? It's not worse or better, they're different, but the physiology, Mark, is the same internally. And I'm not good at quoting research, but I remember Gabor Maté, might have been Bruce Perry, who's another awesome psychiatrist to read his books if you're interested in trauma.
Gabor, I love you. I met him at a conference in the UK.
Gabor is awesome. He's amazing.
Around trauma and addiction in particular, I have a strong interest in. I really recommend him to listeners.
All his books are fabulous, definitely. And then the other person who's not as well known is Bruce Perry, and he does fascinating work. And maybe I'll talk about him in a second because I do want to credit him. But, he has seen that, or we've seen that this sort of insidious, silent trauma, it actually can be just as severe as the combat soldier who has an injury or sees something horrific. And we know this from looking at children that were put into foster care. And there's actually, and again, I'm so bad at quoting research and numbers, but it was something like the amount of suicide in children who are in foster care when they grow up is a high level. It's a very similar level to returning war veterans. I know that seems a little extreme, but they looked at it, and because of the circumstance, like what would put a child into foster care, and even though the parents were well and loving, their underlying physiology was still such a mess, and nobody addresses it because they're in a good home, they're in a safe home. And so there's this question of why do I have these problems? We see that a lot in adopted kids who, again, come from a home life that isn't good. They're adopted by loving parents, and they really are, and it's safe. And then they wonder why the child has all these developmental problems, ADD, etc. They might get into addiction later in life, and it comes back to that underlying stress physiology. So if that little one wasn't taught how to self-regulate, a war zone and living in a household where one isn't allowed to express are almost the same in many ways. And it's one of these things that we're just starting to understand. So it's a real delicate topic, because I agree, your friends who are like, people here don't know war. And yet I'm thinking of have you heard of a man by the name of Sebastian Junger? He's a journalist. He's a war journalist.
Okay, no, it doesn't ring a bell, but...
Yeah, he wrote a fascinating book called Tribes. And he looked at the research post 9/11, so after the World Trade Centers came down. And I don't know what caused him to look into this, but he found a piece of research that showed that all of the war veterans living in Manhattan after 9/11 needed their anxiety and depression medications less. And it was because the energy field of New York City was different after 9/11. Many people felt it was safer because there was a massive tragedy that everybody had a shared experience of, and it connected people. And I'm not sure if you've ever been to Manhattan, but it feels that way. It's one of the safest cities in the world that I've ever been in. And it's just lovely, and people talk to you and you can ask questions. And so there was this big dip in people's need for their medication after that event. And so it's a fascinating thing, because here on North American soil, the trauma is very silent. The societal, I call them decencies, are very silent, and yet they influence and impact the physiology because the system can't express, versus other cultures where, So I'm not sure if that's...
with this one, if I'm honest, just to jump in, because like 10 years ago when I first discovered the kind of trauma, or 12 years ago when my teacher was into trauma and no one had heard of it. Mm-hmm. And I was like, guys, you really got to understand this, because this affects so many areas of life and intimacy, and so much and how things play out is because of numbing and hyperarousal and bad self-regulation. You guys have got to learn about this. That was 12 years ago. And it just wasn't on the radar. And now it's fucking everywhere. And like, part of me is not sure whether our generation are making like a huge leap forward in human understanding, or if we're just a bunch of whining, whinging, spoiled little brats just looking for something to be upset about. And I think particularly on the kind of, there's a sort of politics to this as well. There's a sort of liberal side of the spectrum that likes to be upset and triggered and traumatized. There's a political element to it. And part of me goes, I don't know, I'm just feeling uncomfortable, because I've been in difficult households growing up, and I've been to war zones, and they're not the same. They're not the same.
Mm-hmm. They're different. They're very different. My mother is from the Philippines, so I'm half Filipino. So I've been to that country a lot. I've seen, the way in which those cultures live, the way that they teach their young how to self-regulate. And those cultures also, that specific culture has been subjected to a lot of trauma. My mother grew up during Japanese martial law. She remembers grenades being dropped from the sky and having to duck, and her sisters were being almost sold into sex slavery. It was not a good time. And yet the level of community, faith, if you will, singing, culture, food, everyone lives together. It's a simpler life in many ways. That all facilitates, if I get a bit sciencey, the growth of the vagus nerve. It's called the ventral vagus nerve. It's the one that teaches our heart how to calm down, basically. Yeah. And the thing that's interesting is so you've got that country that's had so much abuse and so much intergenerational trauma and poverty, and yet they're very happy. They're healthy people. And that hasn't occurred, say, here in Canada in the same way. And so why, or in North America? So then the question is, well, what do we have to complain about? We haven't been under martial law. There's not bombs falling on our heads. We have more clean water. Like, what is it? And if we look at that, the way in which a little human being is born, when they're born, they don't know how to self-regulate, because you mentioned the self. And so when a culture has more of a healthy self-regulation energy, if you will, due to better co-regulation with the parent and the child, the grandparent and the child, etc., the tone of the nervous system and the regulation is just healthier.
Yeah.
And so when there's a traumatic event, they bounce back. There's a resiliency there that
resilience factors are just massively not looked at, are they? Like, why is it those two people in the car accident, you mentioned one gets strong, one doesn't? Yes. You know, the fact that this is Gabor Maté stuff, right? Like, we're kind of the unhappy lab rats who are isolated and our own, getting addicted to cocaine, killing ourselves and getting traumatized, as opposed to the lab rats who live in the rat heaven that he created, where all the rats are hanging out and having a good time in a healthy society.
Yeah.
So they're partying together. Meaning and belonging and all these things are just massively kind of inoculating against trauma in a way that may not be present in a kind of isolated urban environment or suburban household or whatever.
You betcha. I mean, that's exactly it. I mean, you and I are in a very similar kind of world, I would assume. I'm in a city. I'm assuming you're in some kind of city, you know, and the way that we live is very isolating in this more Western world. And, you know, there's another wonderful study that came out ages ago called the Rossetto effect. Did you ever come across that in any of your readings? Malcolm Gladwell, who's a very popular author here in Canada, the United States, he popularized it. And what he did, and because you might have lots of Europeans listening, I'll speak to it quickly. He found a piece of research where in the eastern seaboard of the United States, there's this little town called Rossetto, and it's filled, it actually doesn't exist. It exists, but that generation is gone. In the 50s and 60s, the Italians immigrated to this little town. They called it Rossetto, and they were an anomaly for the doctors in the area, because none of the men were dying of the general diseases that most white American men were dying of, which was heart disease and, you know, heart attack. And they thought they were just dying in their sleep of old age. And so they went into this little town. It was a mining town. And they're like, well, are they doing something crazy? You know, are they drinking spring water from a well that's giving them youth? Like, what is it? And they found out they all smoked. They all worked in the quarry mine, so they were inhaling terrible fumes. They ate a lot of bad food, and they didn't exercise. Most of them were overweight, and yet they weren't dying of heart disease. Whereas down the road, in another eastern town called Bangor, actually, were more English settlements.
Welsh name.
And they were, and they were also working in the same quarry mines. They were also drinking. They were also smoking. They had the same diet. And they're like, but they were dying of heart disease and heart attack. And so the doctors, the epidemiologists looked at this, and the only difference that they had, Mark, or the only difference, was that when they did smoke and drink and eat, they were doing it together. Mm. They went to church. They prayed. They had so many civic clubs, community centers, social support. That type of interaction with your people helps the vagus nerve be healthy. It you know, when you have an accident, when you have someone calm by your side, it brings your heart rate down. Your immune system improves when you have a nice nurse versus a nurse that doesn't have a good bedside manner, right? And so they looked at this and they started to really, Malcolm Gladwell loved this piece of research because to him that they were outliers. That was for his book, Outliers. And it's like, that community stayed healthy, not because of their lifestyle, food, and exercise. It was the interaction and the social support, which directly influences the health of the nervous system.
Yeah, there's another sort of social resilience is a huge part of it. And if you spend time in Mediterranean cultures, I was spending time in Spain, and I was just so struck about how much of the day that we're with other people, eating and having time, connecting, laughing, hugging, having sex if they're Italian, obviously, and and that various layers of social support, from the lover to the grandmother, everyone helping. Just playing with kids, it just seems so healthy. And there was another study of the civil service in the UK, which is like our big government study. Yes. And the senior people in the civil service don't have heart attacks. And what they figured out is to do with status. So because they were sort of high status monkeys, they weren't subjected to the same sort of social stress, even though they had horrible lifestyles of drinking scotch and smoking cigars. Yep. And none of them were having heart attacks, and they realized, it's because they had that sort of high social prestige. They were sort of dominant in the kind of dominance hierarchy of the civil service, which is very rigid. And I find these factors, these social factors, pretty interesting.
They are. They're actually, I think, America is a mess. I'm in Canada. My husband's American, and most of my teachers and friends are actually American. And if you look at that country as a just their healthcare system, their government, their system, their social healthcare system, the social justice system doesn't take care of their people. It only takes care of you if you have the money to pay into the system to get the care. And so there's this general, I like to use the word din, this sound, this quality of unsafety. Like you are at the mercy of how much money is in your bank account.
I had that when I visited, because I grew up with the National Health Service in the UK, which I love. And I was quite poor, and I was like backpacking around, and I thought, shit, if I get ill, I'm dead. And all of a sudden, my whole system the hair went up on the back of my neck. And America's got some lovely people in it, and certainly some beautiful nature, but it's a terrible country. It's an absolute mess. As a country, it doesn't work. The prison population's absurd. The kind of military side of it's absurd. And it's just not a safe place to be unless you're very, very wealthy. And that's so different from when I'm in Sweden, and there's this sort of sense of sort of like, hey, almost sort of smug, safe. My wife always laughs because she's sort of like, cause she's Ukrainian, which is quite unsafe historically. And to her, they seem sort of comically naive because it's so coddled and so kind of safe. And there's this sense of, well, everyone has enough. And of course there's enough. So these are quite, if I think of sort of Britain, Ukraine, Sweden, America, these social environments are really radically quite different in terms of the kind of sense of safety that's in the body there.
Oh, it's completely different. And, if we bring it back to child rearing and what actually creates a healthy human adult, it all comes down to that interaction with the mother, and not only as a baby, but in utero. And so in the United States, because you're so afraid, because you have you'll have help. Some people will have it, and most people do, but it's very basic, very minimal. And so a mother will be working up until the very end of her pregnancy. She's stressed. She can't really rest. I'm not sure, I'm not up on my laws right now, but most companies do not offer paid maternity leave. They certainly don't offer paid paternity leave. They might if you're again in that higher echelon. And so you have these little babies being born who need mother. They need that connection to learn how to self-regulate, but they're being dropped off at daycare. They're being looked after by a grandmother or a nanny that really doesn't have that same interest, if you will.
Yeah, there is a connection in the same way.
Definitely.
Just to jump in, the key thing here is that babies can't self-regulate. So they rely upon the nervous systems of caregivers being relatively calm, settled, happy. And if they're not, then that gets passed on to the child on a physiological level, which is an embodied memory. It's not a traumatic thing happening necessarily, but that agitation, the hyperarousal or the numbing, whatever it is being passed on, which means that those children are then growing up less able to self-regulate themselves which is much more likely to lead to addictive issues where they're self-regulating, where they're involved in crime because they badly self-regulate, and various other factors. So there's a sort of a vicious cycle that can happen there, right?
It's a completely vicious cycle. It's the populace. Again, I'm being general here, but it is the populace of America in many ways, because you learn self-regulation, as you said, from your caregiver. And if that caregiver is not self-regulated, so if you have an adult mother that is not able to calm herself down naturally, right, that will be, unless she does something to change that, that will just be passed on through nervous system wiring, because that's what the baby sees, that's what the baby feels. And so we've got this epidemic right now, like you said, of addiction and violence, but also illness. We're seeing it much younger now. Like normally the chronic illnesses hit when you're like 50, 60, maybe 40, but now a lot of my students are coming into my work in their early 20s, and they're a mess. And again, they haven't had that severe traumatic adverse environment. It is that lack of attunement. That's really the word. The attunement is so poor, and it's because the attunement to the person. So if I'm that mother, if I have poor attunement to my body physiology, it is going to be damn hard for me to attune to a fresh new human being that's overwhelming me, right? And so if I can't attune to my own gut and my own brain stem and my stress physiology, there is no hope in hell that I'm going to be able to teach that to this little person. Peter Levine actually said a brilliant thing one day at a class I was at. This was years ago. And he said, and he has this way of just saying things kind of that people catch sometimes. He said, thank goodness for all of the Hispanic nannies that have raised the American babies, because if it wasn't for those Hispanic nannies, we would have a much bigger problem on our hands. And I believe him to be true. I've witnessed families that have that more Spanish or Filipino nanny that understands connection and that kind of community and love and, nurturing. And luckily those children get exposed to it because mom and dad are these high executive CEOs that are never home. Right. And so that actually has saved many families in America. I think, if they didn't have that, I think the system would be even worse off.
You've just reminded me, you talked about being Filipino. I was on Dubai and there was all these lovely Asians there looking after children. I didn't know the Philippines. We don't really have people from the Philippines in the UK, not many.
Yeah.
And I was like, who are these nice people treating the children really well? And so I said, there's a lot of Filipino workers here. And I said, oh, right. And I got this tremendously positive impression of the country through seeing a lot of the sort of care that was being taken, the kind of love and the sort of warmth and the softness. And I thought, I'm never having children till I can afford a Filipino nanny. That's what I thought. So, fantastic.
It's so true. It's true. It's a very
letters now, but cultures can be more or less healthy in regard to social movements. I mean, that's really almost.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think we're all human. We all bleed the same color blood, and yet the way that our cultures are and how we formed our various societies, it really displays the health or non-health. Iceland is another good country. I mentioned the man Bruce Perry, psychiatrist. He has a wonderful book for those that want to read about him a bit more called Born for Love. Born for Love, Why Empathy is Essential and Endangered. And he compares the social structure system of the United States to Iceland. And at the time in Iceland, maybe it's changed by now, I'm not sure. There were no prisons. Like, they didn't exist. And the level of care and government assistance, the amount of maternity and paternity leave that a child could have with their parent was so high. And it was reflected in the state and health of the country. So that book was written maybe 10 years ago. I'm sure there's been some changes.
Iceland's a really incredible country, and everyone I meet from there is both lovely and deeply weird. If you know,
Yes.
Bjork's a good example. She's just adorable, and you want to cuddle her, and she's strange as hell. So that they are quite unusual, and they believe in pixies and fairies and all sorts of things as well. But
their creativity has been fostered. So when we aren't living in a survival response, when we're not always worried for our next meal or safe, or worried if we can go to the hospital if we're sick, that survival energy it's not even there. And so it allows us humans to develop the part of our brain and embodiment that is creative and is a bit more quirky. And I think that might be one of the reasons why I don't have any friends who are from Iceland, but I know what you mean.
Apparently all the good-looking women from England were abducted by Vikings and taken to Iceland. That's the legend there as well.
I believe it.
So, that's why things are as they are. I'll leave it there.
They're beautiful.
That's very attractive. So let's talk about politics a little bit, because I feel like politics is kind of the elephant in the room with trauma.
Sure.
And I feel like there's two extremes, and obviously North American politics is so crazily divided, but around the world now there's these big divides and lack of conversation, which is, lack of listening is a trauma symptom right there. But it seems like on the one hand, I've been around conservatives who sort of denied trauma, said no, stiff upper lip would be the British version of that.
Yeah.
There's a no, carry on. And I've heard family in the British Army who would certainly never discuss trauma. They would just regard that as bad form. And there's a denial of trauma on the conservative side. And then there's this weird victim mentality embracing, almost like, how can I put it? It's like, it seems to me like the left has developed this weird religion of victimhood where it regards it as noble to be traumatized. So not just as unpleasant and something to be dealt with like you would an illness, but something as morally superior. So this so I hope I've upset everyone listening with that description. So there's this extreme that relate to trauma in both very dysfunctional ways. I never hear politics and trauma discussed. So what's your take on that?
I've never heard it broken down that way. Canada's a bit different because we don't have the strong red and blue in the same way here. We're kind of just a soup. But once, as you were saying that, I think sometimes in shapes, Mark, so forgive me as I kind of conjure up this shape, but it's like, you're right. There's that stiff British upper lip. I was married to a Brit for 8 years, so I know this.
I apologize on behalf of my country for all the bad sex.
Yes. He was a lovely man, but just couldn't tap into those feelings. And it's true. It's a sort of stoicism, if you will. And stoicism is actually becoming really popular in some circles, which is
it's trendy.
Some of it okay, but to the point where it's a little too much. So if I talk nervous system physiology, which is my thing, that stiff British upper lip, that children are meant to be seen and not heard, all of this is very much that very high level, we call it shutdown, that freeze. It would be functional freeze. So plodding along, going about your day, not expressing any pain, any sorrow, any joy, even any sadness.
Yeah.
Right. And then there's the other side, which is kind of this complete pool of emotion. In our work, we would call it very undercoupled. So it's like you've got this pool of a person that's just a mess. Their emotions are everywhere. They can't bring a little bit of stoicism into their body to get through the day. And it all comes down to resiliency. So that very stoic, shut down, functional freeze individual is really living in what we would call extreme rigidity.
Yeah.
And it's a word that's intellectual, but it's also in the tissues and the physiology, right? The spine is rigid. I'm sure you've seen this in your clients. The hips don't move. The guts are constipated. There's this like tenseness. And then the other is so fluid and so loving, but to the point where there's no boundary and there's no definition of where I begin and the other person starts. You see it a lot
you see that with a lack of borders, right? Like one person wants to build a wall and the other person believes that no walls are necessary whatsoever. I mean, that's a very literal boundary issue that you see in Sweden, Germany discussed. You see in America with, Trump's supposed wall. And, that strikes me as a very obvious sign of two very different boundary issues, like one, the sort of over-bounded one, the other boundary. And the other thing I've seen is that the inability of much of the sort of far left and some of the right to self-regulate. It's almost like they're trying to control the entire world because they can't control their own triggering. They can't control their own nervous system, so they're trying to control the rest of the authoritarian left and the authoritarian right. Seems. Do you know what I mean by that? Like, I'm
no.
hysterical, triggered Canadian college student. The part of me feels just needs a good slap, but I'm sure that wouldn't help. Like,
well, yeah. No, I
self-regulation.
It's self-regulation. I mean, here's how I'll speak to it. There's been a lot of protests recently. There's always protests, right? And when you really look at a lot of that, it's not really helping the cause.
It's tremendously dysfunctional. It does fuck all, does no good. It isn't anger. There's hate, there's violence, there's rage, there's dysregulation. If every single person who marched in the United States over the last year actually just worked on their own shit and stuff and trauma and worked on their own, we could call it anger towards their family system, there would be really no push, no need to go out and do that sort of protesting because you would sort of be at peace. It doesn't mean being ignorant to the problems of the world. That isn't the case. But Tony Robbins, actually, I don't know if you came across that thing, the Me Too statement that totally got him. Recently, he had to retract because of the pressure on him. But maybe there's some interesting points in there. Like one of my teachers used to say, if you want to see violence, go to a peace rally. There's something about that, just screaming at other people, pointing the finger, that just doesn't seem well regulated, right?
It's not well regulated because it's putting you, the person, into more stress physiology.
Yeah.
It's not actually integrating what is inside that is hurting and is wanting to protest that. So if I think about what happened I don't know Tony Robbins. I know people who know him, but I'm like, what happened? And so I watched the clip at one of his events that everybody was just butchering him on. And the man did nothing wrong. He was very clear. He's like, I don't have anything against the Me Too movement. It's the way it's being used that I don't agree with. It's not being productive, and then what happened was people got confused with the word anger, which I think we're really shitty at defining. And so people interpreted that he was saying that women shouldn't be angry. It's like, God, no, of course. Anger is very essential. It's an emotion that we need. It's the survival mechanism. But what's happening is that anger is being bled out into rage and violence and hate. Anger in its purest sense, and Gabor Maté writes beautifully about this in one of his books, The Body Says No, anger is actually just an energy. It's the desire to want to hit, to strike, to scream, to set a boundary, but it's actually not harming another person. The moment we harm, it becomes violence. And so there's a lot of violent energy in a lot of these protests that I believe aren't actually getting us anywhere. But
one of my Zen teachers calls it anger, fierce caring, as opposed to violence. But I mean, there's nothing so vicious as a hurt, righteous person. And I remember one of my trauma teachers said, look, a real sign of trauma is black and white thinking.
Yes.
That's definitely something I'm seeing a lot of in the world right now. And, again, full victim to myself as well. I don't want listeners to think, well, so come on, Mark, you're accusing people badly self-regulated. Yeah, I am sometimes. I get caught in that. And it's like, how can we actually dialogue? And I'm noticing embodiment people have much better dialogues about a lot of these topics. Like kind of conservative leaning on some issues, but I had a really good dialogue with someone from the left on this podcast. point people to that episode on, it's called Gender and Sex Robots, the episode. And it's two people with very different politics having a really good, listening, fun conversation. And it
debate, a good debate.
Yeah. And afterwards we both went, that was fun. It's nice to meet you. And we're friends now, me and Anita. Yeah. And I just thought, wow. And it was really stood out as rare because I think because of the lack of this kind of self-regulation out there and the sort of potential viciousness. And there's this saying that hurt people. And I put this out and people really didn't like it, that traumatized people are dangerous. And from no fault of their own, they overreact and they get violent. And I see that in myself, just to own that in myself as well. Yeah. Like, people want to sort of put the victim up there as the sort of sacred victim. I think that's part of the left's ideology. Whereas actually I go, okay, the victim, let's help them. How do we treat that? How do we work with that as individuals and societies? And this can really get nasty. Yeah.
No, you're right about hurting people. A person who is in good regulation, self-regulation, a person who has the ability to self-reflect and to be empathetic, they cannot harm another human. Unless, of course, that human or that animal is physically trying to hurt them and then they're going into survival mode to protect their own safety. That's different. But in if we want to call it cold-blooded, without reason, there's a fascinating Netflix show on right now. It's on the Unabomber, who's an American. He's in prison now. Ted Kaczynski is his name. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this guy, but
yeah.
Peter Levine actually talks to the mother in one of his books, because this man was tortured as a child, and then he was tortured in university in scientific experiments, and he was rendered basically unempathetic. He was put into a deep survival shutdown to endure these Harvard experiments that were actually run by the CIA, interestingly enough. And he's the product of torture.
Yeah,
and so, what's that?
Hitler too, right? Shell shock, abuse. Listen, Irene, we're a little short on time, and I really want to get to. Here's always my question: what works? So I think we've described the problem. I point people to your other resources on biology and physiology, because you described some of the biology really excellently. There's a lot of people full of shit on this subject, but you kind of really decide point people to other podcasts and other things where you're on the biology. But I feel like the most important piece is what works.
What works?
So let's go there. What helps us get out of this mess?
The number one thing, and you might not expect me to say this, but it's education. It's learning. And this is something I've tested with thousands of my students online. When people learn the real intricacies of what the nervous system is, how it gets formed, how it gets thrown off, there's this internal cog that starts to turn, because as humans, we're very smart and we need an explanation. We need to understand. And so what I found as a baseline essential foundation, if someone is suffering from any of these ailments or symptoms of a dysregulated nervous system, the first thing is to understand what that actually means, as opposed to just going to a therapist who does this or this or this because someone said it's good for trauma. Yeah. Because we're so unique and we've had different histories, different cultures, what is good for one person does not necessarily mean it's going to be good for another person.
Yeah, I've seen that. People say, what do you recommend for trauma? EFT or TRE or somatic experience? And I really want to say, I really wish I could just give one answer, but it doesn't really work.
And there isn't. I've met some people who have had really good success with TRE. I've had some people who have gone into more post-traumatic stress because of TRE. I've seen people, same with the SE work. SE work is more, it was developed for more shock trauma-based traumas. Whereas if someone had that lack of attunement, mama wasn't regulated, and of course then produces
for that, the complex kind of, accumulative.
The complex trauma is, to be honest, what I have put together, which is the somatic experiencing, the work of Kathy Kane. She just recently wrote a book that's out. Kathy Kane's Somatic Practice is her work, and I can send you the link. And I've seen that with Peter's work combined with Feldenkrais, which is what I do, is a pretty potent triad, if you will, trifecta of pieces, because it's getting the shock trauma piece, it's getting the mind-body piece with the Feldenkrais, and then it's getting the early developmental trauma. Essentially, if someone's had early developmental trauma, Mark, they need to go to the basement of that nervous system and work at the level of the stress chemistry, which means literally working at the level of how your adrenaline and cortisol is released from your adrenal glands, working with the gut, working with the brainstem. And by gut, I don't mean feeding it good food, has nothing to do with that. It means teaching the system how to find safety again. So when we've had any kind of traumatic experience, we are put into a sense of unsafety. We feel threat, whether it's internal or external. And so one of the first things, apart from education, is teaching a person what it means to actually feel safe in their biology. And how that happens will be very determinant of the person, their history, what they have access to. But I've seen when education is the first piece,
it's kind of empowering as well, isn't it? Because it's not like, you should go and get this treatment. It's like, okay, it's understand yourself. And personally, I don't think just cognitive understanding is enough, but it's a hell of a good place to start, because then people start noticing behaviors. They can start, reaching out for other modalities that may be helpful, looking at the whole biopsychosocial kind of solutions there. And then they might have a good experience with EMDR or a good experience with somatic experiencing. But it's, I think it's such a biopsychosocial big problem, spiritual, that any one piece is only ever always going to be part of the puzzle.
Yeah, that's it. That's why if you talk to anyone who works at this level, they don't just have one certificate. They have multiple certificates, which is sort of where I'm at. If someone, and this is more of a cautionary note, if someone has post-traumatic stress or anxiety and they seek out someone who's only trained in EFT or who's only trained in EMDR and they have no other supplemental training, I would be cautious.
Yeah.
And I say that with experience, because I've seen too many of my current clients we use the term blown up.
Yeah.
Their nervous system will blow up when the practitioner isn't able to attune to the level of dysregulation that their client has, and they'll miss something. And all it takes is missing a tiny little something for that human system to just either go too big and too chaotic or shut down even more.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
It does, yeah. I mean, I'm training 2 different trauma treatments, and I don't treat trauma ever, because I don't regard myself as qualified. I do a little bit of trauma education for yoga teachers, but I won't touch patients around trauma, because I just go, like a few weekends or a few weeks doing courses doesn't quite cut it. So,
and that's really important to understand your scope of practice. To not be, as we'd say in here in Canada, don't be a hero. If someone is working with someone who you suspect might have some serious dysregulation, let them know, let the person know, I think this is what's going on, and let's help find you someone who can work at this level.
I have 2 or 3 really good trauma therapists just on my phone, and I regularly give their numbers to different people, different genders, different modalities. And I just find that so helpful. When I get into territory, I go, you know what, this feels like not quite what I can work with. Yeah. I'm really going to recommend, say, my friend Shoshana, who's just ridiculously qualified. We should get on the show actually sometime. And and I say, look, she's going to be really good. Oh, you want a guy? Okay, you should go with Roger. And he does the MDR. And I just find that's essential. And listen, unfortunately, we're on time. I promised myself a yoga class for my own self-care. Though I feel like we could talk a lot more. This has been delightful and informative. 2 things to finish. One, where can people find you? My
website, it's irenelyon.com. A lion with a Y.
I will make sure we link to that as well. And last of all, final parting message about the body for all our listeners.
Final parting message. I'm going to piggyback after what I said, and that's that learning is healing and healing is learning. And if you can learn about yourself and really understand what your human body is and how it works, how it was thrown off in the past, and what needs to happen moving forward a lot can change. And then with that, there needs to be a desire to make it change.
Wonderful. Irene, I've really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah. Good to meet you. You're welcome.
If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to get more. If you'd like to help us build the Embodied Tribe, leave a review on iTunes or share this on your social media. If you're interested in training globally, sign up to receive the newsletter at embodiedfacilitator.com. Until next time, welcome home to the body.